All right, welcome everybody to this next webinar of our iClaim project. This time entitled Discourses, Narratives and Counter-Narratives on Irregular Migration. And my name is Bastian Vollmer. I will be moderating this session today. And I think in previous webinars, we have been sort of clarifying a couple of concepts, how we understand irregular migration, irregularity, etc. But just for, as a reminder, what we do in the iClaim project. So we aim for actually 6 countries, which are Finland, Italy, Germany, Poland, the Netherlands, UK, as well as, that's it. What we try to do is we try to revisit more or less the construction and configuration of irregularity or people being irregularized. And we try to do this from multiple perspectives and multiple methodologies. So we try to, and we already did in the previous webinar, we look at policies and politics and production of irregularity, as well as looking at narratives and discourses, which is our focus today. But we're also going to run a survey very soon to sort of verify how dominant and powerful those discourses are, with a survey on perceptions of people on irregular migration, or the perception of irregular migrants, so to say. But we're also going to do an ethnography in places in those 6 countries, and going to check more or less on the social reality of irregular migration / irregularized people. But in the end, we would like to bring all together this data and trying to reconsider and re-theorize the very matter of irregularity. But today, we're going to concentrate on discourses and narratives, as well as counter-narratives, and we're going to focus on 3 countries. We're going to speak, and we have papers on our today's agenda on Germany, Italy, as well as the Netherlands. So we're going to kick off with Markus Rheindorf talking about the German case. Then we're going to move on to Giulia Garofalo on the Italian case, and then we Irregular of the University in Krems, giving us some comments and questions to kick us off basically for the discussion at the very end of our webinar. All right, I think we're going to kick off with Markus, and I invite you, Markus, to give our sort of very fresh data and results of our corpus linguistic analysis, as well as a qualitative analysis on the case of Germany. Markus.
Thank you, Bastian. It also falls to me to say a few words about the general methodology that we use in all 3 of the case studies, so that it doesn't have to be repeated by everyone. We frame this whole thing as discourse analysis of discourses in media, politics, and civil society, 3 social fields, combining quantitative and qualitative aspects of text analysis to reveal 3 things, basically: the representation of irregularity and irregular, so representation, associations of key terms such as migrant, refugee, etc., across a large data set, and third, dimension of these texts. If anyone's interested, of course, we have sort of this list of kind of text, genre, work, corpora. Of course, they're quite different for the media than for politics and civil society. In media, we found print media, politics on text produced in official institutions such as parliaments, and web page text, leaflets, etc. So for all 3 fields, we collected texts that not entirely, but at least in some part, talk about irregular migration or irregular migrants, although the terminology, of course, can differ. Just a quick overview. In total, there were literally millions of words in our corpora. How we analyze the data. So this is methodology in its core sense. The relative weight of individual words in the specific corpora by frequency. The aggregate, the sum weight, the sum frequency of words with a similar meaning, establishing what we call semantic groups or macro topics in those discourses. The habitual associations of words. Linguistics calls that collocations, so strong connections between words that form a cognitive bond, for example, between migrant labor or laborer and exploitation or exploit. And fourth and finally, narratives about such key concepts, migration, migrants, labors, family, etc. So those four methodological steps. Now quickly move on to the German case so I can say a few words about this here. Now, the three discourses, media, politics, civil society, have quite different semantic preoccupations. So they focus on different topics. And here you can see a quick overview in terms of large topic areas ranked where the weight differs between media, politics, and civil society. First step. Then the macro topics. So aggregates, many words included here, for example, for work and labor. So this turns out to be the most dominant topic in the media texts that we collected, even though not every text talks about work. Every text talks about migration in some sense, and yet migration is not the strongest topic, which means that there is often a preoccupation, a very strong preoccupation with work in these texts, media texts, that is. We also see that certain other topics, such as the subjective experience of migrants, are rather, say, marginal compared to the labor topic here. Now, on this level, of course, we can also compare media, politics, and civil society, and we see interesting shifts of what do these different fields actually focus on. Sorry, I wasn't aware that my circling would remain. Anyway, so moving on to the narrative dimension. With the media, so what we did, we found salient narratives based on the quantitative results. That means these aren't all the narratives that are in these texts, of course, that would be impossible, but salient. That means we have high frequency words. Sometimes it's also words that are unexpected in the respective corpus. The table that you see here shows you how we built these narrative dimension, always beginning with one of what we call base words. In this case, it's migrants. And around these words, we built plots, settings, evaluations, the usual components, the required components of something to be a narrative, rather than just a description or an explanation. Now, ultimately, what the insight that we gained into media narrative was that they produce predominantly narratives that include some moral or other judgment or evaluation. They use prominent gender markers, especially when it comes to crime or suffering. And where crime is gendered male, suffering is gendered female, with the characters in these narratives. We also found that it's almost exclusively personalized narratives. So narratives that include a name, some personal attribute, rather than just migrant, that lead to evaluations. So evaluation in the media seems to be require a personalized narrative as a condition. Tabloids and political media, unsurprisingly, do this quite differently. where tabloids use emotionalized narratives. More higher quality media tend to link to evaluations about geopolitics, for example. We also found that media tend to link such narratives about irregular migrants with other narratives, which are often about Germany or Germans as helpers, heroes, about German politics, or Germany's role in Europe. This is a particularly interesting point because politics and civil society do this differently. So the linking of narratives. Now, we did the same thing essentially for the three corpora. So here you can see the large topics for politics. The most interesting difference here is that the strongest topic in politics is politics. So talking about itself, basically. But still, work and labor, also in politics, is a larger topic than migration itself. So this really moves or pushed into the foreground in both of those discourses. Now, for the narrative dimension in politics, we see different patterns. Politics, technocratic discourse, by and large, tend to use more impersonal or abstract narratives. So no names, no personal attributes, migrants, figures, numbers. They also combine narratives about irregular migrants and migration with other narratives, but even more so than the media. So these other narratives, we see cases where there's up to 5 narratives that are about Germany or COVID or other things. So there's a very strong embedding of migration narratives into sometimes larger or more ideological narratives that reveal quite a bit about the speaker as well. We also see some gendered narratives here, where religion and masculinity, maleness, seem to be strongly linked. And suffering, again, feminized. In civil society, these large topics look absolutely different. As you can see here, the strongest, absolutely strongest topic is the subjective experience, the everyday life and experiences of irregularized migrants. Work and labor, while still a relevant topic, is much further down with only 8% of the overall text. Rights and obligations and migration form the third and second largest topics. Now, civil society narratives use both personalized and impersonal narratives, distinct from both media and politics. They tend not to link such narratives to other narratives. And if they do, it's usually just to one and at most 2 other narratives. So there's less connecting and embedding of these stories into larger stories about Germany or Europe, for example. They tend to avoid identity markers, especially about men. And when they do, it's more about women, families, or children than male migrants. This is also the only discourse that actually addresses the vulnerability in intersectional contexts. Politics didn't do that. Media also did not do that. They produce narratives with stronger than the other discourses, judgments or morals. And it's the only discourse that uses, in any significant way, speech or indirect speech of migrants. But even so, it's usually very limited and brief at the beginning or at the end of the text. And it's also the only discourse that appears not to use migrant and refugee, the terms, in combination or interchangeably. Both the media and politics usually do that. Now, there are a few key comparative insights from comparing the 3 discourses that I have a few words about. Media portray migrants as an overwhelming, illegal rather than irregular force that crosses German borders. Politics represent migrants as virtually indistinguishable from refugees, as people who illegally or irregularly, both terms are used, are growing in number, growing in effect, and are seeking work. Civil society, in contrast, represents migrants, irregularized migrants, as people, human beings who might happen to be men, women, children, fathers, daughters, who have a life, families, rights, human dignity, hobbies even. This is a much more ground level approach to individuals. Migration rather than migrants. So migration as a more abstract concept in the media is represented as something that should be limited, tackled, stopped, reduced, or entirely ended. So these are the associations that we found. In politics, migration is closely linked to flight of refugees as something that should be also controlled or stopped. Whereas in civil society, it's represented as a central issue for Germany. That's a phrase that comes up very frequently. As something that is linked to integration. An interesting contrast to politics, which does not link this strongly to integration. And as something that's driven by multiple crises, regional, global crises, and should be met with efforts at regularization. So there's more contextualization happening here in terms of the causes of certain kinds of migration than in the media or politics. In the media, there's also quite a heavy focus on not just work, but crime and the actions and experiences of irregular migrants are a little bit more prominent than in politics. They're most marginal in politics and most prominent in civil society. And it's also only in civil society that what we call alternative narratives that deviate from 90% of what we see in mainstream media and politics. These are alternative or different in the sense that they put irregular migrants in their stories in contexts where they go to school, where they buy groceries, and where they meet, have coffee, do everyday things that are relatable as well. So even the personalized narratives in the media, which they do use, don't do that. They're personalized, but they're about flight, suffering, not having money, being desperate. So there's a strong victimhood narrative there in the media. They're alternative also in that there are more narratives about women than young men. Young men are the most common character in media and politics narratives. So that gives them overall, that gives irregularized migrants a different kind of agency. They're not necessarily more empowered, but they have more varied ability to act and interact with their environment in these alternative narratives. However, and this is true across the entire data, the German data, migrants are most often portrayed in physical and emotional actions. So eating, sleeping, arriving, coming, traveling, or emotionally feeling. But very, very rarely in verbal actions, saying, discussing, even shouting. And that is indicative, that indicates how rarely migrants across the entire data, how rarely they are actually given a voice. And then at that point, I would conclude the German case.
Thank you very much, Markus, for the insight of the German case. And because we're pressed on time, I would like straight invite Julia to present the Italian case.
Hi, hello everybody. My paper is gonna actually have a focus on work. So I'm within the issue of public discourse on migration and irregularity, which we all addressed as countries involved in the I Claim project. What I am going to focus today, my paper on, is the issue of work and exploitation. As far as the methodology, we use the same methodology that Marcus explained. In fact, thank you, Marcus, very much, because he was our official trainer across countries. Let me just tell you a few more words. So reminding that, so the general research question of the project was to analyze public narratives and alternative narratives on irregular migration. So the three corpora of text, once again, they are built by us in order to analyze irregular migration. So not migration in general, but a bit more focused on irregular migration. And in a sense, the three corpora, so the assumption is that media and politics are expected to reproduce more mainstream narratives, and the hope was, or is, that the civil society will actually contain some alternative narratives, which is, of course, what is an alternative narrative? Thank you, Marcus, for also engaging with that. But it is still somehow an open question. And part of my paper engages with the question of whether in civil society actually has some alternative narratives. So for the Italian case, the media corpus was created through collecting texts from 5 mainstream newspapers, which you can see here, from different political leanings. And it is important to stress that in terms of search terms, we used terms which have to do with irregularity, migration, but also irregularity in work. In particularly, we associated migrant to undeclared work. This is exactly because I Claim works also on the spectrum of irregularity of migration status and work status for migrants. The politics corpus is bigger, of course, in terms of tokens, just like the German case. One word on the civil society corpus. So we had 33 pro-migrant rights organizations, including one grassroots a few trade unions, and mainly NGOs. And also we included a tiny minority of so-called uncivil society organizations, which campaign against migration. We can say more about the methodology of how we selected the sample, but we did it also in collaboration, I want to mention that, with our engagement part on ActionAid, as far as including the key, what we consider the key stakeholders in this field in Italy. So let me start from the main lexical and semantic characteristics of the corpora. So there is a big difference between politics, which we see, just as in the German case, is mostly busy with talking about the political process, its representatives, and what comes up often as propaganda, right, the exact term, conveying an urgency and necessity, in particular regarding issues of rescuing migrants by sea and international obligations. Instead, other issues which are very important to our project, such as the conditions of migrants and their experiences, and even migration itself, remains marginal in this corpus. Instead, media and civil society do show a strong interest equally in politics and policies, but they also are preoccupied with other topics, such as, in connection to regularity and regularization, in particular, reception and detention systems, and migrants' freedoms and rights for the case of civil society. So this is a graph representing the main topics, the topic groups, like just as in the case of Germany, we grouped terms by topic, and we see that politics is the main preoccupation for all of the corpora, but we see that there is a strong also interest in migration and labor for the media and civil society, as well as for the civil society interest in rights, welfare, and there is also interest in the subjective experience of migrants. It's interesting to note that crisis, in spite of the fact that we do analyze, because the period of analysis was 2018, 2023, so COVID was there, but actually let's say in the language, in the semantic, crisis is not present very much across the corpora. So because in media and civil society we did notice a strong interest in labor, we decided to focus on the semantic preoccupation with labor. In fact, the data that I'm presenting today is only the quantitative part of the analysis, not so much the qualitative. So as we see, this is the normalized frequency, so very strong in both civil society and media. We can say a bit more about this interest in labor, because actually labor contains, for us, both labor work, and so we can separate a work part, a labor part, and an exploitation part. And this is the visualization of the interest or the preoccupation, semantic preoccupation with exploitation is in orange for the three corpora. So our research question has been, how do the texts talk about labor and exploitation? What kind of labor exploitation they talk about? And the same, how do they talk about workers, female workers and male workers, and what kind of workers? Okay, so this is through the methodological tool of collocation. And so we asked the question of what are the most significant differences between media politics on one side and civil society on the other, and whether alternative narratives are reproduced in the civil society or not really on these topics. So we started with looking at what labor is associated with. So we see that so agriculture is very present in media, politics, and civil society. Well, domestic work, the domestic sector is absent in politics and is very present in the media and a bit less so in civil society. Work or labor are associated with exploitation and with irregularity, where irregularity we defined as a semantic group which really only includes words and terms related to regularity, regularization. So it's a very strictly defined semantic group. So we continued with analyzing a series of words somehow related. So this is exploitations, fruttamento, and again we can see that agriculture is quite present across sectors. Domestic work, domestic sector is not present, so there is basically no association between domestic work and between exploitation and domestic work, but sex work instead appears. And interesting to see that also crime appears. appears. I will try to go a little faster through the data and then talk about the conclusions, so it is a bit more understandable, I think, for everybody. So we then analyze separately male workers and female workers. So here we have male workers, which we see are quite strongly associated to agriculture, but also to migration, and in the case of media and civil society, through irregularity. There is actually other sectors appearing in the case of politics. That would be interesting for another paper. Female workers instead are associated strongly with domestic work and a bit with agriculture. Also for the media with issues related to sex and gender. We will see in a moment when we talk about actually the term women, how this is important. Because we analyze both female workers and women, and found out some interesting elements there too. So then we kept exploring, because female caregivers are the key of the associations also between female workers and domestic work, and we see that in their case they get associated strongly to family and elderly people, so the side of employers. To labor rights and rules, but they have no association to exploitation, okay? And in the case of media, there is also a remarkable absence of association with migration policies, and with the irregularity very, very low, okay? We will comment on all of this at the end. So the male farm workers, braccianti, I disassociated between media and civil society and politics because they were remarkably different in terms of unit. Anyway, the exploitation, we see that they are instead, as opposed to what we found for caregivers, they get very associated to exploitation in the media and to migration. And interesting, civil society, less association to exploitation, but there is an interesting association to collective organizing, which is something new compared to other terms. Then we decided to also look at immigrants as a word, because immigrants get, as we can see, associated to work in general, but to more specifically agriculture, okay? And they get associated to strongly in the media, I'm talking about media, to irregularity and security public order. There is some similarity between civil society and media here, but not everything. And also, if we look at extracomunitari, a typical Italian word to indicate those who come from outside the community, which has become slowly but surely quite stigmatizing. Agricultural, there is also evidence that there is an association between extracomunitari and agricultural work, okay? So, and crime and irregularity as far as media, but also civil society doesn't really use the expression extracomunitari much, but so if we try to, this is the women. It is interesting to see that women do not get associated to work, whether in politics or in media and civil society, but systematically associated to pregnancy and children, violence, vulnerability, and migration. So if we need to conclude, we see that on the one hand, politics show preoccupation with labor and exploitation very, very marginal, and irregularity is not associated with workers. Migrants are not seen as workers, but as people who arrive and are in need of rescuing, need of accommodation, detention, and eventually need of repatriation. On the other side, media and civil society have a significant preoccupation with labor and exploitation and look and see migrants as workers in a sense. Even though labor and exploitation are linked to one another in the narratives, however, they conveys each of them different associations. So on the one hand, we have labor, which gets associated with employers, rights and rules, also irregularity, and domestic work, but much less with agriculture and migration. Instead, exploitation is associated with crime, agriculture, but not so much domestic work. Instead, we saw sex work appearing. Exploitation is also strongly associated with irregularity, employers, but the association with migration is present a bit in civil society, but not so much in the media. So the main conclusion that we can propose is that labor and exploitation really are represented along very polarized lines according to sector, gender, and origin. So the same lines actually we find in politics, okay? So on the one hand, we have female workers who work as caregivers, and all the corpora associate them to employers, so families, elderlies, but also rights, rules, but not with exploitation. In media and civil society, female caregivers are associated with irregularity, but only in the field of work, not migration. In fact, migration is a theme with which they are not really associated that much. In politics, instead, they are associated with migration, but not irregularity. And as we saw, all the corpora clearly seem to distinguish between female workers and women, where women, as we just said, are not associated to labor and exploitation, but to pregnancy, children, violence, and migration. This is the final slide. So on the other side, we have the male workers, very differently represented than the female workers. They tend to work in agriculture and they are associated to exploitation. The media associate them to migration, specific origins too, and also by indirectly associating them to immigrants and extracommunitari, they associate them to public order and crime. Instead, civil society avoids the association with Africa and as an origin and to irregularity of migration, or it doesn't use the association to extracommunitari and immigrants. In fact, it doesn't use the word extracommunitari. So it disassociates them from public order and crime, but associates instead to exploitation and interest in collective organizing. So if we try to conclude in terms of alternative narratives, we can say that the civil society texts operate a certain interruption of mainstream narratives in relation to migration origin, crime, and security and public order, but not so much. They don't challenge the existence of the polarization in this field of representation, in particular along gender lines. In particular, civil society text can be said to produce alternative narratives on male workers, but not on female workers or in migrants in general. Okay, I stop here. I hope I didn't take too much time. Stop sharing.
Thank you very much,
for your
Julia,
attention.
for the insights of the Italian case. I straightforwardly would like to invite Minka Haya to talk about the Dutch case.
I started halfway in my presentation, but I will start at the beginning. I will close. I will try to be fast as well. So for the Dutch case, we followed the same methodology as the other two cases. We looked at the 4 biggest newspapers in the Netherlands, and for the political corpus, we included political transcripts and also party programs of national parties in 2 national election cycles we had in the 5 years we looked at. And for civil society, we mainly looked at websites, press releases, newsletters of organizations, as well as some more niche media outlets. For the Dutch-speaking people, we talk about outlets like One World. And looking at those three corpora, if we look at the on the level of the words, for example, we see already that there is quite a distinct preference in words in all the three areas. So very briefly said, we can see that in media, there is as well a focus on the Netherlands, but also very much, if we look more to the bottom, at Europe and European, so it's supranational politics that is focused in media discourse and in word level. Then in politics, like in the German case, there is a preoccupation with politics, which as a methodological note is also part of how political transcripts are made, where names of ministers and speaking via the chairperson in parliament is included a lot in the transcripts and therefore appear high on the high frequency word list. If we look at civil society, then we see more a focus on welfare and healthcare. Also because these organizations from which we sampled the texts are in the Netherlands, the organizations that provide welfare to irregular migrants. I also looked at the terminology preferred by these three corpora to refer to the people we're talking about, irregularized migrants, which is something we use in iClaim, but as you can see, is not very much frequently used in the rest in the research. So we see, for example, I will highlight some that the media is actually the only corpus that's structurally uses illegal and illegal migrants. Whereas, for example, for politics is the only corpus that uses alien, so the translation of vreemdeling in Dutch. Whereas the civil society corpus is the corpus that prefers and has a clear preference for the term undocumented or ongedocumenteerd in Dutch. So there we see also that these texts have a different way of speaking about irregular migrants. Like the others, we grouped the words in themes with similar semantic meaning. And then we can also see that they have a different preference and they lean towards different topics. So for example, if we look at the media, which is the first graph here, we see that there is a clear interest in politics. So we see a lot of media speaking about what is happening in politics and reporting on that, as well as an interest leaning to geography. And similarly to the high frequency words, these geography words are referred to Europe. So it's both the Netherlands is a geography word, of course, which appears a lot, but more than that, it's European, Europe, EU, and member states, words like that. And then if we look at politics, we see a clear interest in politics and in policy making as well, which groups also in the politics semantic group. Then civil society, there we see it's a bit different. So we see this subjectivity category, which is quite big, which means that there are more words that describe people or emotions. It's actually the only corpus that structurally defines emotions as a topic, as well as welfare, which, as I said before, leads to these civil society organizations because they provide welfare measure to irregular migrants and they talk about that in their communication. So if we look a bit more to the specific case, so now if we look at the media, the Dutch media, and if we then, for example, look at which words occur together, apologies for the spelling error, we see, for example, if we take the base words of migratie, so migration in general, we see a lot of words that define this as legal or illegal in also those terms, and then mainly defining it as illegal or irregular migration. But something else we see is like desire for controlling migration. So we see a lot of words relating to control, like grip, so to get a grip on migration, or uncontrolled or controlled migration. Those are words that occur a lot in Dutch media if we look at the base words of migration, as well as, again, supranational politics in especially Europe or the European Union. Let's see. So we didn't talk a lot about the proto-narratives, but we see then typical narrative form this takes. So the government should get a grip on migration, or the EU has to collaborate to counter illegal migration. These are the sort of phrases you would see in media. Another interesting aspect of the Dutch media corpus is the discourse that I want to highlight on veilige landers, which refers, and is a new term, referring to migrants from so-called safe countries. And if we see this occurs significantly often with the word Morocco. So we talk about veilige landers, talking about migrants, but specifically from North African countries, mainly Morocco. And they are described in terms of nuisance, overlast, the Dutch word of overlast. So this can be described as sort of bad behavior not otherwise defined. And then what we see in this discourse is how this is very clearly linked to then shelter and how shelter is organized. So we see in these news articles, for example, like the connection is made with people coming from so-called safe countries that cause nuisance, and therefore their shelter has to be austere. So they should not have the same reception facilities as other asylum seekers in the Netherlands. If we look at this more on the qualitative level, we see this very clearly. So people from so-called safe countries are framed as people who have little chance of being allowed to stay, and they cause a lot of problems or nuisance, which then is linked to an erosion of social support for so-called real refugees, and is linked to a sober reception facility, so asylum seeker reception center that gets 0 stars on TripAdvisor. If we then look at politics, but and continue in this case on the topic of shelter, we see another thing that is linked, that is very prominent in the politics corpus, is regio, so the region. And here you could think of many things of geography, but this is very clearly intended as the region of origin. So also not otherwise defined, but at least as long as it's not in Europe, then that's the regio according to Dutch politics. Also an interesting distinction is that if it's about displaced people, in the Dutch politics, it's also always people from Ukraine and never people from somewhere else. However, then we see this in shelter. This is very more general shelter for all migrants, but in the Netherlands we have a very specific policy on shelter for irregular migrants, which is called the Landelijke Vreemdelingenvoorziening, so the LVV, or the National Alien Provision, which then on its turn is very much described in policy terms, not political terms, and is very clearly distinctly framed as a pilot that's other than the general policy, so which has to be evaluated. This we also see if we look at this qualitatively. You see that the LVV, so the shelter for irregular migrants, is framed as a contradiction to national policy. So the national policy is framed as one of deterrence and of limiting support for irregular migrants. And then the LVV is seen as contradictory to that, so has to be abolished. Well, I would say fun fact is that they actually stopped the financing of this shelter this year. So we could have already seen it coming in the discourse, I guess. Moreover, we see, if we look qualitatively at the discourse on this shelter, is the so-called softness of municipalities. that sort of oppose this harsh, strict national policy, and then in the national politics, municipalities are framed as not cooperating with the policy of the national policy of deterrence, and there are these propositions of cutting funding to municipalities that want to house irregular migrants, or are framed as not cooperating with national policies if they do not want to push people to return. Going then to the civil society and staying on the topic of shelter, we see that in civil society, shelter is discussed quite differently than in politics, also because civil society has a different role in these shelter programs. So on the one hand, they provide the shelter, but also, as we see, it often occurs together with words that describe guidance or counseling, or words that describe support, and also it's framed as a government, but at the local level. So, which this plays on. However, also here we see that the LVV, so the National Alien Provision, is framed as a pilot that has to be evaluated. Interestingly, I think, is that in civil society, shelter is very clearly connected to homelessness, or as in Dutch, you can refer to it as living on the street. Where we see an interesting distinction between becoming homeless, in an indirect becoming, so ending up homeless, and being made homeless, whereas the indirect ending up homeless is more present in civil society, also in the combination with not cooperating with the national LVV policy. So we see this proto-narrative of people can end up on the street if they do not cooperate with return, instead of a narrative which could be imaginable, that people who do not cooperate with this policy are being kicked out of the shelter and therefore being made homeless. But that's not something we see. Another tendency in civil society is that they use personal stories to illustrate policy. So policy is also very present in civil society, but in a different way. So there we see civil society organization using individual stories of individual migrants to illustrate larger policy tendencies. We see this very clearly in the topic of the child regularization, where there were a lot of articles of civil society organization, on the one hand, celebrating residence permits. See, this individual person has obtained a residence permit through this regularization. And on the other hand, critiquing a failing policy using individual cases. Then if we, to conclude, maybe I think looking also at the previous two presentations, it's interesting to look at what we didn't find. So maybe more in line with the others is that we did not find a lot of migrants agency. So there's a lot of focus on policy and politics, but irregular migrants actually doing something for themselves is not something we found. I think a possible explanation, especially for the civil society corpus herefore, could be that we, because we focused not on social media, but on texts on websites and press releases and newsletters, that this might be less present, and also more grassroots organizations or migrant-led organizations in the Netherlands do not publish their text in Dutch, but prefer English as a more lingua franca for those organizations. Second finding for what we didn't find, which is a contrast, especially I think to Julia's presentation, is we did not find irregular migrants who work, I would say, at all, but overall we did not find that. However, most words related to work are like civil society organizations working on something, or politicians working on a plan, or people do not work on their return, but working as in having a job is not something that we found, only because in the civil society corpus we did include also texts from the Migrant Domestic Workers Union, and they talk about domestic work, but so there we could find something, but it's absolutely not representative of the rest of the Dutch corpus. So I will close it with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minke, for this very concise, I think, and very exciting findings as well. Before we open up the floor and start our discussions, I would like to invite Albert Kraler to make his observations, comments, questions. Albert.
Thank you very much. Well, I will start with a few observations. Well, first of all, thank you for these very insightful presentations and the very rich analysis that you have presented. What I really found interesting is the commonalities and the differences that spring to mind across these three countries, like one common element here that you pointed out in all of the presentations was the strong focus of civil society organizations on personal, subjective narratives and personal stories. And also on a structural level, the differences between the three bodies or fields of discourse, politics, media, and civil society, which is on the one hand to some extent obvious, but on the other hand, I think it's also rare that this is being done so systematically, and discourse is often portrayed as a sort of a uniform master discourse that's where everybody sort of concedes. So this sort of differentiation, I think, is very much welcome. And very much needed also to see differences in different fields. And I think there's even potential to multiply that even further and bring in, I don't know, other special discourses, for example, business associations, and or if we talk about irregular migration at all, and that's of course also a little bit a question, or break it up in on a scalar level. So look at, for example, specifically focus on regional newspapers or on regional actors, like how do mayors and provincial governors talk about irregular migration? And actually, that's one of the questions I would have. It came up a little bit in the Dutch case, this difference between national and local discourses, but I would want to dwell a little bit more on that perhaps. What I've found also interesting is the different emphasis on topics. So in Germany, a strong focus on borders, arrival, migration processes, but also work. So I've found that definitely media, less in the civil society, but still these two topics spring to mind. And in the Netherlands, it's very narrow, very specifically focused on asylum-related categories of people, which I didn't see in the German case, a little bit also to the same extent, which I found also a little bit surprising, by the narrative seems to be a little bit broader. In one way, the strong focus on labor in Italy is not surprising, given the role of irregular migrants on the labor market. But at the same time, I also found it interesting that from in the beginning of the presentation, you also painted a more general picture that the focus on migration as a process and arrival is not as strong, but very strong in relation to man. Finally, I thought that I really also liked the gendered analysis in the Italian case, pointing at the different narratives to about women and men. Actually, also to some extent in the other cases in Germany, when you, Marcus, show the perspective of civil society on, or if they talk about identity markers, that it's very focused on women and family. So it's a bit it seems a vulnerability trap in which civil society organizations are also falling here. What I observed also, and I'm not sure if that's really completely true, that the civil society discourse and the media discourse in Italy seems to be closer than in other countries. And I'm not sure if that's true, but the more general question is also, how do the different discourses travel between each other, or narratives from one discourse travels to another? It's clear there's of course different logic also of discourse production and reproduction in the media, whereas at least in the quality media there is a sort of a professional efforts of trying to bring in different sides and producing a balanced narrative, like in science a little bit. That's not the case in advocacy or in politics, but still one wonders who dominates, who sets the agenda. Now, a couple of questions, perhaps. I was actually also surprised about the absence of Corona and COVID and the pandemic crisis in all of this. And a more general question is, what about the temporality? What about the specific timing of that you were selected, and how does this influence the results? And did you, within that 5-year time period, did you see differences in emphasis or topic distribution between different, maybe around an election campaign, for example, or in the Corona crisis, or around certain incidents? I'm just wondering about this temporality, also to contextualize individual narratives more. A second question that I also would have is linking up on the specific focus on rejected asylum seekers and asylum seekers with low chances of recognition in the Netherlands, is to what extent do these status-related groups appear in the German and Italian case? Is this at all an issue, or is this basically subsumed more under a generic notion of irregular migrants, and when they are domestic workers or agricultural workers, but their actual exact status or context is not so important? And finally, a final question is perhaps when you looked at the association between different words and terms, did you also look at the values, positive or negative, that were associated with a particular association, for example, between irregular migrants and work, or any other sort of combination? I think I'll stop here so that we have some room also for other questions.
My sincere apologies. I have technical problems. I don't know why. I think last couple of questions I couldn't hear, Albert, but let me respond just to one question, and I think then we go through the countries maybe, because there were a couple of observations as well as questions by Albert to the presenters. The question on COVID, we were very surprised that it didn't appear as dominant, and because it was also one of the questions we wanted to ask, how, and especially when you look at the UK in terms of essential workers, because it was a huge discussion there. We were surprised as you were or are. It's. I think I can speak for most of the countries, Marcus. It's entirely absent. We have no explanations yet. We really have to dig into the corpora why, and it really appears very at the bottom of frequencies. The question on temporality, and we would have wished to you have to prepare the corpus when you build it, and to sort of make it clear, and the data of the text, and that would have been very laborious to do that with the entire corpus. We wished to do that, but we basically wouldn't have the time. The building of the corpus would have taken too long. But then you would have a longitudinal a development of certain corpora narratives. So excellent. But also we ended, which was a pity, but that's about methodology and the project, because it runs through. We had to end in 2023. Now 2024, everybody is probably agreeing a lot of stuff has happened, and now the discourse actually changed again, or we could say it turned to the negative even further for for a lot of places and spaces. But I think I stop here and invite. Shall we go through the countries, Marcus? I think there are a couple of points also on methodology in terms of verbs and terms. I think you can comment on that too, and then we go Julia and Minke. Okay.
All right, thank you. So one of the questions, the more specific terminology for the precise residence status, statistically, it's not relevant. Let's put it that way. Yes, these words do come up, but compared to the very general and often legally imprecise, incorrect terminology, it's so marginal that it makes no sound. It's a very tiny ripple in the discourse. Yeah. The second question I noted for Germany, or in general, we look at the values of these associations, like positive, negative, etc. Not statistically, so we don't have a number where you can say 68% of the associations for the word migrant are negative and 20 are neutral, and so on. No, it's part of the qualitative interpretation of sort of the collocates, the associations, to look at that. I don't think we really showed a lot of that today, but we have the data, and that's part of what we're doing. So I can see, for example, that there is a difference, for example, between migration and migrant in Germany, where migration more or less balances illegal and irregular, those two alternatives. Migrant, it's much more illegal than irregular. So migration as a process, as an abstract entity, is more or less 50-50 irregular or illegal, whereas the people are almost always called legal, except in civil society. Not stigmatizing, of course. Yeah.
Thanks, Marcus. Julia and Minke, you want to chip in?
Yeah, thanks for your observations and stimuli. I don't have much to say, in the sense that, yeah, we didn't really did the distinction between national and regional, local, which I think would be very relevant too for Italy. And in terms of temporality, also we didn't notice huge changes, but of course we could have looked for them, but I guess it's a further step. As for the asylum seekers, so issue, we actually used as one of the search terms asylum seekers, and it is a term that it comes up used very often across the three corpora. As such, we don't really have an expression of refused, not refused. So this is not something that is part of the Italian language right now. But it is, they are, I mean, in many contexts, asylum seekers is used in a way that very generic, where people don't actually know what it means, and interchangeable, So both in politics and media, of course, not in civil society, but yes, so that is also very present in our corpus. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia. Just to also comment on the suggestion that to look also at regional or local levels. It's absolutely, we had this, last week we had our stakeholder meeting and another person made this suggestion, and I entirely agree. And especially because, speaking for the German case, it will be very different, I think, which I think much more in a benign way, talking about migrants as well as arrival, and that being on the media as well as on the politics level, which makes us a bit think of sort of democracy and the structure of democracy and how it works in democratic theory. But we cannot probably expand here on this. But Minke, you also have a reaction to Albert's comments?
Yes, I would like to say two things. I think first observation is interesting. In the Dutch case, I did not include asylum seeker as a search term because it resulted in so many more articles and texts that the irregular migrants were completely snowed under, let's say. However, nonetheless, this topic of the asylum seekers from safe countries was very prominent. And I think if you look at the texts, what it does is it shows how people from safe countries are spoken about sometimes in the same sentence of people who have already been rejected. Their asylum claim has already been rejected. So we see this sort of discursive construction of people from North Africa as irregular migrants before while they're still in their legal right to claim for asylum, let's say. And I think the second thing I would like to say was on the topic of the framing of the municipalities and how this relates. I think that's a very interesting idea to look also at the regional or the local communication. We didn't do that, as we already explained, but of course in iClaim we do more than just the discourse analysis. So we know I did also interviews with people at the municipalities and have attended meetings about the abolishment of this shelter provision for irregular migrants. And there you see that they have, if we look at this from a multi-level governance perspective, of course, they also have a different responsibility towards these people. So they have a completely different stance in this thing, and then that they need to protect the individual people, but also safeguard public safety and order. So they have a different role. And then it's interesting to see that at the national level, even though, of course, at the national level, they know about this role of municipalities and their different responsibilities, but still they are framed and talked about as if they are lax or lenient or not in line with the national government. So I think that's, but it's still something to continue working on. So thank you for your comments.
Thank you very much, Minke. We are very tight on time, as you can see, so we timed ourselves very well, but I still would like to open the floor for questions by the audience, comments, so do please raise your hand. So there is, yep, there's one. Ms. Dorsley, yes, please. Yep, we can hear you.
Perfect. So my question is, I know that in the presentation on the Italy data, the presenter said that the data collection was focused from 2018 to 2023. First of all, my first question would be, is this the same timeline that everyone followed? And secondly, could you explain why you chose those dates? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I will pass because this is all the same for everybody, so you can maybe respond directly.
Yeah, everybody did for the same period. It was in part practically because we had to, in terms of where to end, because we started more or less the data collection at the beginning of the year, 24, and then we had to think about where to start. So we had to include We didn't want to include in inverted commas, the so-called migration crises for several reasons, but also in terms of data collection. If we would have covered 20 years, we would have probably corpora of, I don't know, 150 million per corpora, and that would absolutely stretch our capacities of data gathering. It's mostly a practical answer. Hope it's satisfying. All right. Are there more questions and comments? Maybe to come up at a later point. We are reachable by email. You can consult our lovely website, and also the country studies as well as the comparative report will be published in due course. All of them probably in January as well as February. Okay. There's no need for further discussion. All right, then I would like to thank everybody for joining the webinar. And yes, I hope to see you soon. Yes, Ilse is writing. You can reach us on iclaim@uu.nl. So thanks everybody for joining. Thanks to all the presenters, and as well as to Albert, and see you soon. Thanks. Bye.